You've wandered into the wrong corner of YouTube tonight, haven't you? Or maybe it's exactly where you were meant to end up. Welcome, my brave or foolish friends. Tonight, we're diving into 6 terrifying tales that will make your skin crawl and have you questioning every creak in the dark. These aren't just stories, they're warnings, so turn the lights off, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't look behind you. Let's begin, if you dare. Story number 1. Don't open your eyes at midnight. Let me tell you about something that happened to my friend Adam when we were in college. This was back in 2016 when we were both students at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. Adam wasn't the kind of guy who got scared easily. He was one of those prove-it-to-me types who laughed at ghost stories and rolled his eyes at anything paranormal. But after what happened that night, he wasn't the same. This all started when Adam moved into this old house on Birch Avenue. It wasn't anything special, just a beat-up rental close to campus that he shared with 2 other guys, Chris and Ethan. They joked about how creepy the place looked with its peeling paint and creaky floors, but for $1,200 a month split 3 ways, they didn't care. The weird stuff started almost immediately. The first time Adam noticed anything, it was subtle. He'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was watching him. The house would be completely silent, but he'd get this heavy feeling, like the air was pressing down on his chest. Probably just sleep paralysis or something, he told me when we were grabbing burgers at Diablo Burger downtown. It's not a big deal. But things escalated fast. One night, Chris and Ethan were out, so Adam had the house to himself. He was up late working on a paper, the only light coming from his laptop. Around midnight, he decided to call it a night. He crawled into bed, set his alarm for 7 a.m. and turned off the light. That's when he heard it, a soft tap 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 on his bedroom window. At first he thought it was just the wind. Flagstaff gets these crazy winds sometimes, and the trees in the yard brushed against the house, but then he heard it again. Tap tap tap. Deliberate, rhythmic. Adam sat up, his heart pounding. His room was on the 2nd floor. There was no way anyone could be outside his window. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the glass. Nothing. Just the backyard and the shadow of the old oak tree. Probably a bird or something, he muttered to himself, trying to calm down. But deep down he knew that didn't make sense. Over the next week, the tapping became a nightly thing. Midnight on the dot. Every single night. It started messing with his head. He'd stay up, staring at the window, waiting for it to happen. When it did, he'd try to catch it, ripping open the curtains, running outside to check, but there was never anything there. Chris and Ethan thought he was losing it. "Dude, you need to chill," Ethan said one night while they were watching a game in the living room. "You've been acting weird as hell." Adam tried to explain, but they just laughed it off. Then came the night he made the mistake of opening his eyes. It was a Friday, and Chris and Ethan were out again, probably at some party. Adam stayed in, exhausted from a week of no sleep. He told himself he'd just ignore the tapping if it happened. Sure enough, at midnight it started. Tap, tap, tap. Adam lay there, frozen, his heart racing. He squeezed his eyes shut, determined not to look, but then it changed. The tapping moved. It wasn't at the window anymore. Tap, tap, tap. It was on his closet door. His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The air in the room felt ice cold. "Don't open your eyes," he whispered to himself, over and over. But then he heard the door creak. Against every ounce of common sense, Adam opened his eyes. He immediately wished he hadn't. Standing at the foot of his bed was something. He couldn't even describe it properly later. All he could say was that it was tall, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a dark void, like a shadow that sucked in the light. The thing just stood there, staring at him, even though it had no eyes. Adam couldn't move, he couldn't scream. He just lay there, paralyzed, as the thing leaned closer and whispered something he couldn't understand. A low, guttural sound that made his ears ring. And then it was gone. When Chris and Ethan came home that night, they found Adam sitting on the front porch, pale and shaking. He refused to go back inside. The next day, he moved out. We didn't talk about it much after that, but a few months later, I heard something that made my skin crawl. I was at a coffee shop on San Francisco Street. and I overheard two older women talking about a house on Birch Avenue. Terrible what happened to those boys in the 90s, one of them said. No wonder no one stays there long. My ears perked up. Apparently, in 1996, two college roommates had lived in that same house. One night, one of them woke up to strange tapping on the window. He told his friend about it, but the friend didn't believe him. A week later, both boys were found dead in their beds. The coroner couldn't explain it. No signs of trauma, no drugs in their system. They just died. I wanted to tell Adam, but I didn't. He's never been the same since that night, and I don't think he could have handled it. But here's the thing. Every now and then, when I visit him back in Phoenix, he tells me he still hears the tapping. So if you're ever in Flagstaff and you hear something tapping at your window at midnight, do yourself a favor. Don't open your eyes. Story number 2, The Haunting of the Old Playground. When you grow up in a small town like Gadsden, Alabama, you learn two things fast. Everyone knows everyone, and every place has its stories. Some are harmless, like old Mrs. Cranston, who supposedly buried gold under her rose bushes. But others cling to you in a way that makes your skin crawl every time you think about them. For us, that place was the Maple Street Playground. When I was a kid in the early 2000s, the playground was already falling apart. A forgotten patch of cracked asphalt and rusty equipment hidden behind rows of unkempt hedges. The city just left it to rot, saying they didn't have the budget to fix it up, but that wasn't the real reason. Everyone in town knew it was cursed. The older kids liked to tell stories about it. They'd whisper about the boy who disappeared back in the 1970s, about the swings that moved on their own, and about the strange laughter people heard late at night. I didn't believe any of it, at least not until the summer of 2004 when I was 13. That's when it happened. It all started with my best friend Tommy. Tommy Walker was a daredevil, the kind of kid who laughed in the face of danger and always had a slingshot in his back pocket. He was the one who came up with the idea to sneak into the playground one night. "Come on, Alex," he said, his crooked grin gleaming in the moonlight. "You scared of a little ghost story?" We were sitting on the curb outside his house, eating stale potato chips and swatting at mosquitoes. The air was thick and humid, the kind of night where even breathing felt like work. "I'm not scared," I shot back, even though I totally was. "It's just stupid. There's nothing out there." "Then prove it," Tommy said. Midnight, the playground. Me, you, and Corey. Corey was our other friend, a quiet kid who tagged along mostly because he hated being left out. He didn't say much, but I could tell he didn't want to go either. Still, none of us wanted to be the one to chicken out. At 11:45 p.m., I snuck out of the house, clutching a flashlight and trying not to trip over the loose boards on our porch. Tommy and Corey were already waiting for me at the corner, their faces pale and nervous under the streetlight. We walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of gravel under our sneakers and the distant hum of cicadas. When we reached the playground, it looked worse than I remembered. The slide was covered in graffiti, the swings hung limp and rusted, and the merry-go-round leaned at an awkward angle, like it might collapse at any second. The moon cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt, making everything look distorted and wrong. Tommy was the first to step inside, pushing open the creaky gate with a smirk. "See? Just an old playground. Nothing to be scared of." Corey and I exchanged a look, then followed him in. For a while, nothing happened. We messed around on the swings, dared each other to climb the rickety jungle gym, and threw rocks at the slide to see if it would topple over. It was almost fun, until Corey heard it. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Tommy said, tossing a rock into the bushes. "That laughing." I froze. It was faint, almost too soft to notice, but it was there. A high-pitched giggle coming from somewhere near the merry-go-round. "Probably just the wind," Tommy said, but his bravado was starting to crack. The laughter came again, louder this time. We all turned toward the merry-go-round. It was spinning. Slowly, creak by creak, the rusted metal turned in circles, even though there wasn't a hint of wind. "Who's there?" Tommy called out, his voice shaking. The laughter stopped. "Let's get out of here," Corey said, tugging on my sleeve. "Wait," Tommy said, stepping closer to the merry-go-round. "It's probably just some kid messing with us." But there was no one there. The playground was empty, just shadows and silence. Then the swing chains rattled. One of the swings moved back and forth like an invisible hand was pushing it. I felt a cold wave of panic rise in my chest. "Tommy, we need to go. Now." "Just one more second," he said, his eyes locked on the swing. That's when we saw it. A shadow. It was small, maybe the size of a kid, and it darted from behind the slide to the jungle gym. But it didn't move like a person. It flickered, like a bad TV signal, and disappeared before our eyes. Corey screamed. Tommy dropped his flashlight, the beam casting wild shadows as it hit the ground. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted for the gate, our sneakers slapping against the asphalt. I could hear Corey sobbing behind me and Tommy's heavy breaths as he struggled to keep up. But the laughter followed us. It echoed all around, bouncing off the trees and the broken equipment, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. When we reached the gate, it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck!" Tommy shouted, yanking on the rusted metal. "No, it's locked!" Corey cried. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The shadow was back, standing in the middle of the playground. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. And then, slowly, it raised a hand and waved. We finally managed to climb over the fence, cutting our arms and legs on the jagged metal. As soon as our feet hit the ground, we ran all the way back to Tommy's house without looking back. When we got there, we locked the door and sat in the living room, too scared to speak. "What the hell was that?" Corey whispered after what felt like hours. None of us had an answer. The next morning, we decided to tell Tommy's older brother, Matt. Matt was 19 and thought he was the coolest guy in the world because he worked at the local gas station and drove a beat-up Camaro. When we told him what happened, he just laughed. "You guys are idiots," he said. "There's no such thing as ghosts." But later that night, Matt decided to check out the playground for himself. He took a couple of his friends, some flashlights, and a pack of beer, ready to prove us wrong. He came back pale and shaking, refusing to talk about what he'd seen. All he said was, "You kids were lucky you got out." To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. The city eventually tore down the playground and built a community garden in its place. But I still can't drive past Maple Street without feeling that cold wave of fear all over again. So, if you ever hear laughter on an empty playground, don't stick around to find out where it's coming from. Some things are better left alone. Story number 3, The Forgotten Forest Path. If you've ever driven through the Black Hills in South Dakota, you know how the winding roads can feel endless, like you're the only person left on Earth. Dense forests stretch as far as the eye can see, and there's a silence that settles in the air as the trees grow thicker. It's beautiful during the day, sure, but at night, it's a whole different vibe. This story isn't mine. It happened to my cousin Nate and his friends back in the summer of 2010. Nate swore up and down it was real, and honestly, the guy's not the type to make up stories. They were camping in the Black Hills near a spot called Sylvan Lake. If you've ever been there, you know how picturesque it is. Clear water, towering rock formations, and plenty of hiking trails. But Nate and his buddies weren't there for sightseeing. They wanted to go off the beaten path, to explore one of the less popular trails they'd heard about online. Big mistake. There were 4 of them. Nate, his best friend Kyle, Kyle's girlfriend Abby, and their other friend Rachel. They'd planned a weekend of hiking, s'mores, and ghost stories around the fire. Typical summer stuff. The first couple of days went fine. They stuck to the main trails, took a ton of pictures, and even saw some deer. But on the second night, Kyle brought up the idea of checking out this forgotten trail he'd read about in some forum. "It's called the Hunter's Path," Kyle said, grinning like he'd just found buried treasure. "Supposedly, it's an old trail that hunters used back in the day, but it's not on any of the official maps." Nate frowned. "Why isn't it on the maps?" Kyle shrugged. "Dunno, maybe they stopped maintaining it. Or maybe they just don't want tourists getting lost." Rachel laughed nervously. "Getting lost? Sounds like a great idea." But Kyle was persistent, and eventually, they all agreed to check it out the next day. The entrance to the Hunter's Path wasn't easy to find. They had to bushwhack through some undergrowth just to reach what barely passed as a trail. It was narrow, overgrown, and had an unsettling vibe right from the start. "You sure this is it?" Abby asked, swatting at a mosquito. Kyle checked his GPS. Yep, this is the spot. Nate didn't like it. The forest here felt different. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches forming eerie shapes overhead. And it was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just their footsteps crunching on the dirt. Still, they pushed on, joking to keep the mood light. After about an hour, they came to a clearing. In the center was an old wooden sign, weathered and cracked, with words carved into it. "The hunter's path ends here. Do not continue." Kyle laughed. They probably put that there to scare people off. Or to warn them, Nate muttered. Abby shivered. "Let's just take a few pictures and head back." But Kyle wasn't ready to turn around. "Come on, we've made it this far. Let's see what's up ahead." The trail beyond the sign was even narrower, barely visible in places. It twisted and turned through the forest, leading them deeper into the unknown. The further they went, the stranger things got. The first thing they noticed was the smell. Something metallic, like rust, mixed with damp earth. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to make Abby cover her nose. Then there were the carvings. Strange symbols etched into the trees, spirals and shapes that none of them recognized. "What do you think these mean?" Rachel asked, running her fingers over one of the carvings. "Probably just graffiti," Kyle said, but he didn't sound convinced. Nate's gut was telling him to turn back, but he didn't want to be the one to chicken out. A little further down the trail, they found something that stopped them cold. It was an old, tattered backpack half buried in the dirt. "What the hell?" Abby said, kneeling down to examine it. Nate looked around, his heart pounding. "You think someone left it here? Or someone lost it?" Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kyle pulled out his flashlight and shone it into the trees. "Hello? Anyone out there?" No response. Just that heavy silence. They decided to keep moving, but the mood had shifted. Even Kyle seemed uneasy. As they pressed on, the forest grew darker even though it was still afternoon. The trees were so dense now that they blocked out most of the sunlight. That's when Nate started hearing it. A faint sound, like footsteps crunching on leaves. He stopped and turned around, but there was no one there. "You guys hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Abby said, her voice shaky. "Footsteps," Nate said. "Like someone's following us." Kyle rolled his eyes. "Dude, you're just freaking yourself out." But Nate wasn't so sure. They kept walking, and the footsteps seemed to follow them, always just far enough away that they couldn't see who or what was making them. Then they came to another clearing. In the center was a small wooden cabin, its roof caved in and the door hanging off its hinges. "Okay, that's creepy," Rachel said, hugging herself. "Let's check it out," Kyle said, already moving toward the cabin. "Are you serious?" Abby said. "This place looks like it's about to collapse." But Kyle didn't listen. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was empty, except for an old table and a few broken chairs. The walls were covered in more of those strange carvings, and the floor was littered with debris. "This place is ancient," Kyle said, running his flashlight over the walls. Nate stayed by the door, his eyes darting around the forest. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Then Abby screamed. They all turned to see her standing by the table, staring at something on the floor. It was a pile of bones, human bones. "Okay, we're leaving," Nate said, grabbing Abby's arm and pulling her toward the door. But as they stepped outside, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The carvings on the trees around the cabin. They weren't just random symbols anymore. They were faces. Twisted, screaming faces etched into the bark, their hollow eyes staring at them. "Run," Nate said, his voice barely above a whisper. They took off down the trail, not caring which direction they were going. All they wanted was to get out of that forest. The footsteps were louder now, closing in on them. And then, as they rounded a bend, they saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the trail. It was tall, its body wrapped in tattered dark cloth, and its face was a blank, pale oval, like a mask. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, blocking their path. Nate felt his legs go weak. "What the hell is that?" Kyle grabbed a rock and threw it at the figure, but it didn't flinch. and then it started to move. The thing stepped toward them, slow and deliberate, and that's when they all broke. They ran, tearing through the forest, branches whipping at their faces. Nate didn't even know if they were still on the trail. He just kept running, the sound of footsteps and Abby's sobs echoing in his ears. Finally, they burst out of the forest and into the parking lot where their car was parked. They didn't stop running until they were inside, slamming the doors and locking them. "Drive!" Nate shouted, and Kyle didn't need to be told twice. They never went back to the hunter's path, and none of them ever talked about what they saw. But sometimes, late at night, Nate swears he hears footsteps outside his window. And when he looks into the darkness, he sees a pale, blank face staring back. Story number 4, room 6666. If you've ever been to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, you've probably heard of the Crescent Hotel. They call it America's most haunted hotel. And trust me, that's not just marketing hype. People talk about ghostly sightings, unexplained noises, and eerie cold spots. But what they don't talk about, what they won't talk about, is room 6666. That's where my cousin James stayed one night in 2017. He swears on his life that this story is real, and honestly, I've never seen him so shaken. James was on a solo road trip, hitting up all the weird, offbeat places he could find. He's the adventurous type, the kind of guy who'd go skydiving on a whim or eat gas station sushi without a second thought. So when he heard about the Crescent Hotel, he couldn't resist. "Haunted hotel? Count me in," he said to himself, booking a room online. But when he arrived, the front desk clerk gave him a weird look. "Room 314, right?" she asked, checking her computer. "Actually, can I stay in room 666? James asked, grinning. The clerk's face went pale. "We don't rent out that room." James raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "It's closed for maintenance," she said, avoiding his eyes. James wasn't buying it. "Come on, it's just a number. What's the big deal?" She hesitated, then leaned in close. "Look, between you and me, that room's got a bad history. Weird stuff happens there. Guests complain about things." That only made James more determined. "Perfect," he said. "I'll take it." After some arguing and signing a waiver, "Just a precaution," the clerk said. James got the key to room Tribal 6. The hallway leading to his room was dimly lit, with flickering wall sconces that looked like they hadn't been dusted in decades. The carpet was an ugly floral pattern, faded and worn down the middle from years of foot traffic. When he reached the door, he paused. The brass numbers, 666, seemed scratched, as if someone had tried to scrape them off. The door itself was darker than the others, the wood warped and stained. "Cozy," James muttered, unlocking it and stepping inside. The room was small, with a single bed, a nightstand, and an old wooden dresser. A faded portrait of a woman in Victorian-era clothing hung on the wall, her eyes following him wherever he moved. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't been breathed in for years. James dropped his bag on the bed and opened the window, letting in some fresh air. Outside, the forest stretched into the distance, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Doesn't feel haunted to me," he said, pulling out his phone to text his sister. "James, guess where I'm staying tonight? Room 666 at the Crescent Hotel. Bet you're jealous." Her reply came almost instantly. "Emily. You're an idiot. Call me if you see any ghosts." James laughed and tossed his phone onto the nightstand. The first couple of hours were uneventful. He explored the hotel, took some pictures, and even joined a ghost tour. The guide told all kinds of spooky stories about the place, how it used to be a hospital, how the old morgue in the basement was still intact, how people had seen shadowy figures in the halls. "Sounds like campfire stories to me," James thought, heading back to his room around 11 p.m. That's when things started to get weird. The first thing he noticed was the temperature. His room was freezing, even though he'd turned off the AC. He grabbed a hoodie from his bag and checked the thermostat. It read 75 degrees. "Faulty thermostat," he muttered, pulling the hoodie over his head. He sat on the bed, scrolling through his phone, when he heard it. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from the dresser. James froze, his eyes darting toward the piece of furniture. The scratching stopped. He laughed nervously. Mice. Definitely mice. But when he opened the dresser drawers, they were empty. By midnight, James was starting to feel uneasy. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to press down on him, making it hard to breathe. He decided to distract himself by watching a movie on his laptop. Halfway through, the TV in the corner of the room turned on by itself, blasting static at full volume. James jumped, his heart pounding. He grabbed the remote and turned it off, but a second later it turned back on. This time, the static cleared, revealing an old black and white show he didn't recognize. The screen flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw a face staring back at him. "All right, enough of this," he said, unplugging the TV. Just as he sat back down, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Unknown. "Get out." James stared at the screen, his palms sweating. "Very funny," he said aloud, assuming it was one of his friends messing with him. He replied, "James." "Ha ha, who is this?" The reply came instantly. "Unknown." "You shouldn't be here." James felt a chill run down his spine. He set the phone down and looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner. That's when the scratching started again. This time it was louder. The noise wasn't coming from the dresser anymore, it was coming from inside the walls. James pressed his ear to the wall and immediately pulled back. It wasn't scratching, it was whispering. Low, guttural voices, speaking a language he couldn't understand. "Okay, screw this," he said, grabbing his bag and heading for the door. But when he turned the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he muttered, yanking on it harder. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, filling the room. Then the lights went out. James fumbled for his phone, using the screen to light his way. The whispers had turned into laughter, cold, mocking laughter that echoed all around him. He backed up against the wall, his breath coming in short gasps. "Who's there?" he shouted. The laughter stopped, and then a single word: "Leave." James didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and smashed it against the window, shattering the glass. The cold night air rushed in as he climbed out, cutting his hands on the shards. He didn't stop running until he was outside the hotel, gasping for breath under the moonlight. When he looked back at the building, he saw a shadow in the window of room 6666. It was watching him. James left the Crescent Hotel that night and never went back. He didn't tell anyone what happened except me. To this day, he still wakes up in the middle of the night, hearing whispers. And sometimes he swears he can see a face in the static of his TV. Story number 5, The Whispering Shadows. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, you already know the town is practically drowning in history. It's the site of one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War, and the air there feels heavy, like it's holding on to all that pain and loss. People come from all over for the museums, the battlefield tours, and of course the ghost stories. I'd heard plenty of those stories growing up, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened to my friend, Chris, and me during a weekend trip back in the fall of 2016. I swear on everything I own this really happened. Chris and I were history buffs, and Gettysburg was only a couple hours' drive from our hometown in Maryland. It seemed like the perfect spot for a quick getaway. Cheap motels, good food, and plenty to explore. We got there on a Friday afternoon, checked into this old, slightly run-down bed and breakfast called the Farnsworth House Inn. It's one of those places that leans into the whole haunted vibe. There were muskets and period uniforms on the walls, and the staff told us stories about soldiers' ghosts roaming the halls at night. "Cool gimmick," Chris said, smirking. The lady at the desk overheard him and gave us a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not a gimmick, sweetheart. You'll see." We laughed it off, grabbed our room keys, and headed upstairs. Our room was tiny, with creaky wooden floors and a window overlooking the back alley. There was a weird draft even though the windows were shut and the wallpaper was peeling in spots. Still, it had that old-timey charm we were looking for. We dumped our bags and headed out to explore. The battlefield was incredible. Rows of cannons, statues of generals, and those rolling hills where so many lives had been lost. As the sun started setting, the whole place took on this eerie glow. The shadows got longer, and the wind seemed to carry whispers we couldn't quite make out. Chris nudged me. "You think they play spooky sound effects to freak people out?" I shrugged. "Maybe. Adds to the experience." But deep down, something about those whispers didn't sit right with me. That night, after dinner at some pub downtown, we decided to take one of the ghost tours. It was led by a guy named Marcus, who looked like he lived for this kind of thing. Long black coat, lantern in hand, and a voice that could make even the cheesiest ghost story sound terrifying. He took us through the streets of Gettysburg, stopping at various spots to tell us about the soldiers who supposedly haunted them. Then he led us to a narrow dirt path at the edge of town, just beyond the old Dobbin house. "This," Marcus said, holding up his lantern, "is what the locals call Shadow Lane, and trust me, it lives up to the name." Shadow Lane wasn't on any of the official maps. It was barely a path, more like a gap between two rows of trees that seemed to stretch into darkness forever. "The story goes," Marcus said, lowering his voice, "that during the battle, soldiers used this path to sneak behind enemy lines. Many of them never made it out. They were ambushed, slaughtered, and left to rot right where they fell. People say their spirits never left." Chris rolled his eyes, but I noticed his hand tightening on the strap of his backpack. Marcus continued, "Visitors have reported seeing shadows that move on their own, hearing whispers and feeling like they're being watched. Some say if you stand here too long, you'll feel a hand on your shoulder." He paused for effect, "and when you turn around, there's no one there." The rest of the group was eating it up, snapping pictures and whispering nervously. Chris, being Chris, wasn't impressed. "We should check it out," he said, nudging me. "Seriously?" I asked, glancing down the path. It was pitch black, and the trees seemed to close in on each other like a tunnel. "Come on," he said, grinning. "What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words. We waited until the tour moved on, then slipped away and headed down Shadow Lane. The dirt path was uneven, covered in roots and patches of grass. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, and the trees cast strange, shifting shadows. "Creepy, right?" Chris said, his voice echoing slightly. "Yeah, no kidding," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the ground. After about 10 minutes of walking, we came to a clearing. There was a broken wooden fence, a few moss-covered stones, and a small pile of rusted metal that might have been part of an old wagon. "That's it," Chris said, sounding disappointed. I didn't answer. I was too focused on the shadows. At first I thought it was just the way the trees were moving in the wind, but then I realized the shadows weren't following the wind. They were moving on their own, darting across the clearing like they had minds of their own. "Chris," I said, grabbing his arm, "do you see that?" He frowned, shining his flashlight toward the trees. "See what?" The shadows stopped. For a moment, everything was perfectly still, and then the whispers started. It wasn't like the whispers we'd heard on the battlefield earlier. These were louder, overlapping, like dozens of voices all talking at once. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was angry. "Okay, that's creepy," Chris said, his bravado slipping. "Let's head back." We turned to leave, but the path we'd come down wasn't there anymore. "What the hell?" I whispered, spinning in circles. The clearing was surrounded by trees, but there was no path. Just darkness. Chris pulled out his phone, trying to use GPS to find our way, but the screen kept glitching, the map flickering in and out. "Something's messing with the signal," he said, his voice shaking. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. Chris nodded, his face pale. "We're not alone." The growling grew louder and the shadows seemed to shift, closing in on us. "Run!" Chris said, grabbing my arm. We took off, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that clearing. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. I felt like I could feel them in my head, like they were trying to pull me back. Finally, we burst out of the trees and onto a gravel road. I had no idea where we were, but I didn't care. We kept running until we saw the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. When we finally made it back to the Farnsworth house, we were out of breath and covered in scratches. The lady at the desk looked up as we stumbled in, her expression unreadable. "Shadow Lane?" she asked. Chris nodded, too shaken to speak. She sighed, shaking her head. "I told you. Some places aren't meant to be explored." We left Gettysburg the next morning. Chris hasn't talked about that night since, and honestly, I can't blame him, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. And when I close my eyes, I see the shadows, waiting, watching, whispering. Story number 6, The Doll That Blinked. It was late October in Salem, Massachusetts, and the air carried that familiar mix of decaying leaves, wood smoke, and an eerie chill that always crept in during this time of year. I'd been visiting my cousin, Mia, who ran a small antique shop in the historic district. Her store, Salem Curiosities, was crammed with dusty books, faded trinkets, and oddities from estate sales and old collections. It was the kind of place that attracted ghost hunters and Halloween enthusiasts alike. Mia had invited me to stay for the season to help her manage the crowds, and to be honest, I was eager for a change of pace. I wasn't expecting to find much more than quirky customers and overpriced knickknacks. That changed the night we found the doll. The day had been slow, just a few tourists milling about. Around 6 p.m., right as the sun was setting and casting a golden haze over the narrow cobblestone streets, a man walked into the shop. He was older, maybe late 60s, with deep lines on his face and tired eyes that didn't seem to focus on anything. He held a small cardboard box in his hands. "I need to get rid of this," he muttered, setting the box on the counter. "It's old," he interrupted, almost growling, "and it belongs here." Curious, I leaned over to peek inside. Nestled in faded tissue paper was a porcelain doll, no bigger than a loaf of bread. She wore a tattered white dress, yellowed with age, and had glassy blue eyes that stared blankly ahead. Her blonde hair was matted, and her painted lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. Mia sighed. "Look, mister, it's cursed," he said flatly. That caught our attention. He met our eyes for the first time, and there was something haunted in his expression. "It's been in my family for generations, and I won't keep it anymore. Burn it, sell it, I don't care. Just get it out of my life." Before either of us could respond, he turned on his heel and left, the shop bell jingling behind him. Mia and I exchanged a look. "Well, that was weird," I said, pulling the box closer. She rolled her eyes. "People always come in here with stories about haunted objects. It's part of the shtick. I bet he just wanted us to take it for free." Still, there was something about the doll that gave me pause. Her eyes seemed too lifelike, almost as if they followed you when you moved. "Should we, I don't know, look into it?" I asked. Mia shrugged. "It's just a doll. I'll put it in the back for now." And that should have been the end of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the doll's face kept popping into my head. Those cold, unblinking eyes, the way her smile seemed to twist if you looked too long. Around midnight, I gave up on trying to rest and decided to grab some water. As I passed the shop's storage room, I froze. The door, which Mia had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. A faint rustling noise came from inside. I stood there, heart pounding, debating whether to check it out or wake Mia. Eventually, I grabbed my phone for light and nudged the door open. The box was on the floor, its lid off. The doll sat upright on the shelf where Mia had placed her earlier, but her position was different. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, and her arms, which had been tucked neatly at her sides, were now raised, as if she were reaching for something or someone. And her eyes, they blinked. I stumbled back, dropping my phone. The thud must have woken Mia, because moments later, she appeared in the doorway, groggy and annoyed. "What the hell are you doing?" she asked. Before I could answer, she noticed the doll. Did you move her?" "No," I whispered. "She moved herself." Mia frowned but didn't respond. Instead, she picked up the box and shoved the doll back inside. "You're overtired," she said firmly. "It's just a stupid toy." The next morning, things got worse. We opened the shop to find several items knocked off the shelves, picture frames, glassware, even a few books. Nothing was broken, but it looked as if someone had ransacked the place. "Maybe we forgot to lock up?" Mia suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I glanced at the storage room where the doll was still packed away. I didn't say anything, but my gut told me she was somehow responsible. Throughout the day, customers came and went, but a strange tension hung in the air. Around noon, a woman browsing the shop stopped abruptly in front of the counter. "That doll," she said, her voice trembling. Mia and I exchanged a glance. "What about it?" Mia asked cautiously. The woman shook her head. "You need to get rid of it. Now." "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. It's just a doll. No, the woman said firmly. It's not. She hesitated, then added, my grandmother used to tell me stories about a doll like that. One that belonged to a girl who died tragically. They said her spirit attached to it, and it would move on its own. Great, Mia muttered under her breath. The woman didn't stay long, and when she left, I noticed she kept glancing over her shoulder as if she expected something, or someone, to follow her. That evening, I insisted we do some research. Mia reluctantly agreed, and we started digging into local legends and archives. It didn't take long to find a match. The doll had belonged to a girl named Eleanor Green, who lived in Salem in the late 1800s. According to the records, Eleanor had fallen down the stairs in her family's home and died instantly. She'd been holding the doll when it happened. After her death, the family claimed to hear footsteps in the night and see shadows darting around corners. The doll was blamed, but every time they tried to get rid of it, it would reappear in the house. Eventually, it was passed down to relatives, each of whom reported similar incidents. Why would someone keep passing this thing around? I asked, horrified. Superstition, maybe, Mia suggested, or guilt. I stared at the faded photograph of Eleanor we'd found online. Her wide, vacant eyes mirrored the doll's almost perfectly. That night was the worst. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of faint giggling. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again. Closer this time. I sat up, my heart racing. The room was pitch dark, but I could feel something watching me. Then the giggling stopped, replaced by soft, shuffling footsteps. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the door. The doll stood there, just inside my room. Her head was tilted, and her eyes blinked slowly, unnaturally. "Mia!" I screamed, scrambling out of bed. The door burst open and Mia ran in, flipping on the light. "What? Oh my God," she whispered, staring at the doll. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Mia grabbed a blanket and threw it over the doll, scooping her up and storming out of the room. "We're getting rid of this thing," she said firmly. We drove to Winter Island Park, a quiet, desolate spot on the edge of Salem. It was nearly dawn when we dug a hole in the rocky soil and buried the doll as deep as we could. "I don't care if she's cursed or not," Mia said, shoveling dirt back over the makeshift grave. "She's not coming back." But as we turned to leave, I swear I heard faint giggling again, carried on the wind. The shop seemed normal for a while after that. No strange occurrences, no knocked over items. I told myself it was over, that we'd finally put the doll, and whatever haunted her, to rest. But 2 weeks later, a package arrived. It was a plain cardboard box with no return address. Mia opened it cautiously and her face went pale. The doll sat inside, her blue eyes blinking slowly, her faint smile wider than I remembered. To this day, I don't know what she wants or why she keeps coming back. All I know is that wherever she is now, I'm not going to be the one to find her again.